Hello, I'm Ali Moore. Australia's population ticked over 25 million this year, a target we weren't meant to reach, according to the experts, until 2051. In fact, between 2004 and 2017, the Australian Bureau of Statistics said Melbourne would grow by 500,000 people. It grew by 1.2 million. Now, the experts say Australia will have 38 million people by 2050. But what if those predictions are wrong as well? What if a global crisis means Australia is set for a population explosion? Cities like Melbourne growing from 5 to 8 million people, not in 30 years as is currently predicted, but in just 15. What would our future city look like? And who gets to decide? Tonight, in a joint project with Asialink, the University of Melbourne, the Wheeler Centre and the ABC, our expert panel discusses those key questions in a hypothetical super city. What if Australia has no choice but to embrace a bigger Australia? In the time it takes you to watch this video, one baby will be born in Australia. 2 people will arrive to live here, and 1 resident will leave to live overseas. If you watched it again, 1 person will have died. Overall, Australia adds 1 more to its total population every minute and 23 seconds. That's another 379,952 people every year. So it's no surprise the city of the future is a source of fascination and, for some, fear. Not just because technology opens up a whole new world of possibilities, but because with resources already stretched, how do we cope with ever more people? If we can't afford to buy a house or struggle in peak hour today, what will it be like tomorrow? Will it be the future as Innovate UK paints it, with environmentally aware buildings, automatic transport pods for people and parcels, even augmented reality change rooms at your local shopping centre? Or the dystopian worlds of Hollywood? Los Angeles just a year from now, as depicted in the original Blade Runner. Or the city in the blockbuster film Minority Report, where people are arrested before they commit a crime, not after.
Well, let's not kid ourselves. We are arresting individuals who have broken no law. But they will.
Future cities have become virtually synonymous with smart cities, where technology helps manage everything from transport to health more efficiently.
We found that a city of 5 million people could save 30 to 300 lives per year. Cities could shave 15 to 30 minutes off the daily commute. They could reduce crime incidents by 30 to 40%.
There's no shortage of ideas about how to make our cities work better, but they cost money and take time, both of which are in relatively short supply. Population predictions have been wrong before. So what if, once again, our cities grow much faster than forecast and we have far less time to make them livable for their vastly increased number of residents? In tonight's Hypothetical, our panel will tackle a future city, and the future is closer than you think. So to introduce our panel for this evening, Bernard Salt at the end there. Bernard heads the Demographics Group, which provides specialist advice in demographic, consumer and social trends. He was also responsible, of course, for making smashed avocado synonymous with housing affordability. Lucinda Hartley is an urban designer and social entrepreneur and co-founder of Neighbourlytics, which is pioneering the use of social data to measure the social health of places. In 2017, they collected data on some 200 neighbourhoods across Asia, Australia and also Europe. The Hon John Brumby, former Premier of Victoria from 2007 to 2010. He served for more than 10 years as Treasurer and Premier and 7 years as the federal member for Bendigo under the Hawke government. And for his sins tonight, he is reprising his role as Premier, reigning over our hypothetical super city. Professor Rob Adams is currently the Director of City Design and Projects at the City of Melbourne. He's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Cities and Urbanisation. He has 46 years' experience as an urban planner and 35 years with the City of Melbourne, so there's not much of the city that he doesn't know. Shara Evans is a technology futurist regarded as a leading expert on emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, robots, digital privacy, and the future of health, humanity and work. And Ishaan Nangia is a partner in the global management consultancy firm McKinsey and Company. He specialises in infrastructure, transport, real estate, logistics and education, and he's worked with clients in Australia and also across the Asia Pacific. Please welcome our panel. It's November 2018 and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the world's foremost body, scientific body that assesses climate change, has issued a new report. The news is bad. The rate of global warming is far faster than initially predicted, and the world is now facing severe consequences. Even before this report, the experts were predicting that there would be up to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050. Now, with this new information, up to 500 million climate refugees will have to move in just the next decade and a half. The world has to make a plan. Where will these people find a home? New Zealand leads the way with a world-first climate refugee visa, and other countries follow suit. Australia agrees to take its share. 3 million are allocated to Melbourne. That means with Melbourne's natural population growth, the city will go from 3 million to well over 8 million residents in just 15 years. The first refugees will arrive in just over a year, a steady trickle at first, and then they'll ramp up as that 15-year deadline approaches. They'll come from our neighbours in the South Pacific. They'll also come from countries to the north, which are struggling with the climate crisis. Exactly who we get, we don't know. This is a crisis and we don't get to choose. But we have just 15 years, not just to plan, but to build for these new arrivals. They're coming, ready or not. So, John Brumby, as Victorian Premier, you've just got off the phone to the Prime Minister. He's been briefing you on these climate refugees. It's not entirely new news to you because, of course, this has been discussed for some months. What you didn't know was how many people. Now you know 3 million. Where do you start?
So, thank you, Ali. So this is going to be quite challenging. If you look at the period, as Ali has said, in Melbourne's history over the period 2004 to 2017, the average population growth for Melbourne was around 100,000, to keep it in round terms. So these new numbers that have been given to us by the Prime Minister, which we will be accepting as part of our commitment to help the world and to do our part in Australia, will approximately double that growth rate. So we've seen, just in Melbourne and Victoria, really over that decade, that we've seen some growing pains. Not everybody likes population growth, so it's been a complex issue. So getting this right with a doubling of the population growth will be challenging, and I believe we do need to get it right because the scenario that you've outlined with accelerated climate change may well be real, and so there's a real prospect that these numbers could increase even further in the future.
So where do you start with this?
So we start, I think, we start by trying to get a common vision and a strategy, a common vision across government and across the community. And the key elements of that, I think there are a number of those. The first is we need to understand the political challenge of this. I would be wanting to work towards bipartisan support. We have elections every 4 years, but population is a difficult issue. So I would be looking to brief the Leader of the Opposition and his or her shadow cabinet and try and get bipartisan support. But I think public support is going to be the biggest challenge, and we might come to that a little later. I think we need to work, to use the old-fashioned language, on the triple bottom line. We need to look at how we would do this in a way which maximises the economic benefits for our state and for Australia, in a way which maximises the outcomes in a social sense. How do we build a cohesive and diverse community, but with the best education and health? We need to look at it with very clear environmental objectives. Call it what you will, 5-star plus, 6-star plus, carbon neutral, but that's what we need to aim for. And I think we need to be aiming to apply the world's best technology, whether that's in transport or education.
I'm going to interrupt you here, Premier,
yep.
because you've laid out a lot of things
yep.
that we need to do, but the question is going to be how we do them. So I was going to say, you quite rightly, though, at this point decide that you might need a bit of help with this particular challenge. So you decide to call in one of the country's best-known demographies, Bernard Salt. Bernard, you're not surprised to get this call because you've been watching the Prime Minister's press conference, who's now talking to the whole of Australia about the arrival of these climate refugees. As a demographer, what do you make of this? Is this really population growth on steroids?
Well, it is population growth on steroids by Australian standards and even by Melbourne standards. Melbourne is growing currently, this year, at record levels. Never in Melbourne's history has Melbourne added as many as in the last 12 months. It's a real figure, it's 130,000 people per year. In the mid-1990s, Melbourne was adding 12,000 per year. Gone from 12,000 to 130,000 in about 23 years or so. And the way I'm reading these figures of extra 3 million, that 130,000 over 15 years would be 130, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, and it might plateau at about 500,000. 500,000 added to Melbourne's base now, 4 or 5 times our current rate of growth. How can we possibly manage that? Well, actually, there are cities in the world today that do that. The UN has recently produced population estimates for 180 cities across the world, and Delhi, which has 29 million people, last year added 910,000 people in 12 months. It's the most number of people who have been added to any city ever in history, 900,000. So Melbourne's 130, and I think in this scenario, it will scale up to about 500,000. And it raises the issue, can we just add 500,000 people to the edge of Melbourne, another Cranbourne, another Melton, another Craigieburn, or do we need to actually rethink the model? And I think growth at that scale needs to be rethought. And this is where I think that you need to create a series of interconnected communities so that people don't live out in Bacchus Marsh or up in Kilmore or out in Druin and then try to get to a job in the city centre. You would live, work, play, recreate all within the local area. So the planning needs to deliver jobs, hospitals, universities, shops, all within a local area so that you reduce the cross-metropolitan area commuting. It has been done, it is being done, but probably not to Melburnian standards. Delhi's 900,000 people per year is not delivering the same quality of life as we expect in Australia. That's the great challenge.
So while you two are quietly talking about the fact that I guess with these new arrivals we can't live like we currently live, we on the outskirts of the city and commute into one single CBD, but there's a knock at the door of the Premier's office and Rob Evans walks in. Rob, of course, is the head of city planning for Melbourne and he thinks he should have a seat at this table. Rob, you've heard the problem, 3 million climate refugees in 15 years. Does the number 3 million make you choke on your Wheaties?
Not at all. I actually think that this is a real opportunity, not only for Melbourne, but Australia. But it requires a paradigm shift. What Bernard's talking about and the Premier is talking about is true. There are solutions. But one of the biggest challenges for Australia today is the infrastructure. How do you provide infrastructure for a low-density city, the nature of Melbourne? And I'll tell you a little story. I'm a baby boomer. I arrived at university in the 1960s, and universities were facing this exact same problem in the 1960s. Around the world, you saw a boom and expansion of universities. University I went to was Cape Town University, side of Table Mountain, couldn't expand, national park around it. They asked a different question. They said, how well are we using the stuff we've already got? And lecture theatres were 17.5% of the day. So they said, we'll re-timetable. We'll actually reprogram our policies. So 5,000 students when I was there in the 60s. I went back 30 years later, 15,000 students, and they hadn't built anything. The noticeable change was the vibrancy on that campus. They were just using the stuff they had far better.
And indeed, fortuitously, as it happens, you've done some research, haven't you, about how you could house this number of an expanded population?
We have. About 10 years ago, we looked at exactly this scenario. What happens if Melbourne goes from 4 million to 8 million by 2030? And using that analogy of Cape Town University, we said, well, the one thing you do is you'd put people where existing infrastructure is. So you'd put people around the railway station and all the activity centres, Bernard's Point. You'd then actually look at the road-based public transport, trams and buses, and on the major routes, you'd put your population there, and you'd put them in the brownfield sites. And when we did that exercise, taking into account heritage and all the rest that you'd like to preserve so you keep the character of the city, you could get 4 million people on 7.5% of the land in metro area around the existing infrastructure, and you could save yourself $440 billion in infrastructure costs over 50 years. We might get a more vibrant city.
It sounds like a plan, but a plan that you might need some assistance with as well. So you recommend to the Premier at this point that you bring in another urban planner, an urban designer, and you call Lucinda up. Lucinda, you've been given the broad scenario. What do you make of it in terms of where the priorities should be at this stage?
I think when you're thinking about a really huge influx of people, social cohesion is going to be a major challenge, if not the major challenge of this. And we tend to get very caught up in what we think of as the physical concrete solutions that we need to build, which we absolutely do need to do. But building them too quickly or in the wrong way will result in future slums. It will result in all kinds of social inequalities that we don't want. And there's many ways to avoid that scenario. And when I think about city planning, I think I draw analogies with other businesses and other business, sectors which have undergone exponential growth. Like, let's take technology and startups, which has gone through exponential growth. Now, you wouldn't imagine if you were a startup these days to have a business plan that was 20, 30 years long and build 20 different types of products that were all unique and bespoke. But that's what we do in city planning. And I'm not saying that we don't need a strategy, but we tend to have long range views. We build every single building differently. There's a huge amount of wastage in that kind of model. So what we can do is draw on agile thinking, and we can build essentially building blocks of cities, temporary spaces, modular blocks, things that can be used and tested and grow and change over time. And the reason that I like that model is this is actually what helps build communities, because you build community when you have the opportunity to shape and participate and be involved in creating the places that you live in, and you're able to do that much more easily if you have a more agile and more flexible city. But to support that, you need good data and good feedback loops to know what's happening. So you really could do that measuring
on the 7.5% that Rob's talking about.
And I'm a strong supporter of Rob's densification proposal, but I think that we also need to just be careful that we don't build everything just because, that we're quite careful about building with the people who are moving in and having more agile, flexible models with good data.
Well, you might have gathered by now that the office of the Premier is getting a little bit crowded, so everyone heads down the hall to the closest boardroom. And because, of course, you can't do a major project without having a management consultant involved, Premier, you call Ishaan Nangia, and you're very aware that Ishaan's company has done quite a lot of research on the future of work, and how you get these refugees into employment will be key to success. So, Ishaan, you hot-footed up to the Premier's office. You're not surprised to be called either. You've got real expertise to add here. Where will the jobs come from in the time frame we're talking about?
Well, it's going to be a huge challenge, because not only do we have a whole raft of new climate refugees who'll need to find employment, but we also have at the very same time a massive change in technology, particularly automation and machine learning, resulting in a fundamental change in the way that people work. And our estimates are based on current technology, without even needing to think about how the technology may evolve. Up to 50% of the current tasks in the workforce are automatable. Not jobs, but tasks, because it won't be whole jobs that are automatable. So what we really need to do is to identify and bet on the economic clusters that we think will really drive Melbourne's growth, economic growth and jobs growth over the course of the next 15 and 20 years.
But how do you know what they are? You don't even know exactly who's coming. You know they'll be old, they'll be young, they'll be skilled, they'll be unskilled.
Yeah.
How do you pick these winners to go into this economic cluster?
Well, you start with the clusters that we're already seeing huge growth in. So you might start with biomed, where we have leading institutions, we have companies like CSL that are able to commercialise the technology. And so you build on those sources of strength. Education is the other one, which is not only a great exporter for Melbourne, but which also will have a huge task in reskilling people, adult education, to take on this new economy in a world of automation. So you really start on your strengths, but then you expand into advanced manufacturing and grow food and agribusiness. There are a bunch of things we could be great at, but we need to bet on them and get the leading companies in the world, the leading public sector institutions and universities working together.
Well, at this point, Premier, you decide that you really need some out-of-the-box thinking on this issue. You need a very big-picture approach, and you call in Shara, who's a futurist, a well-known futurist in this area. Shara, you come and take a seat at the board table and you've listened to this conversation, particularly about automation and the fact that some 50% of tasks could be taken over by the robots. Is that just the start of it when you look at what technology can achieve?
Oh, absolutely, just the very beginning, and I agree completely with what Ishaan has said already about the number of jobs or parts of jobs that will be automated. But by the same token, there are going to be whole new industries that are created by technology, and in particular with such a huge influx of population. So one of the new industries that we will see will be in transport, where we'll see things like hyperloops, which are these tubes that you suck the air out of so that it's at near vacuum, and you can literally hurdle pods filled with people or cargo at estimated speeds of up to 1,000 kilometers per hour or even higher.
So that completely changes how close to your workplace you need to live.
Exactly. So if you can imagine that you can actually start having people move to areas like Bendigo but get to the Melbourne CBD in 9 minutes because you're traveling at very high speeds.
You possibly feel sick when you get there, but...
Well, hopefully not feel sick when you get there. But if you can imagine even an entire east coast of Australia interconnected with super high transport, there are going to be tons of new jobs that are created just out of that one sector. And then you get things like flying taxis, and that sounds like Blade Runner, but it's already being worked on now. And there are commercial services that are planning to be launched in 2020, 2021, with literally electric flying vehicles that take off vertically, fly horizontally, land vertically again. And there'll be vehicle-to-vehicle networks that we'll see that control driverless cars, which again are on the very near-term horizon. We're talking the 2020, 2021 model car year for those kinds of features.
And indeed, we'll look at transport more closely in a minute. But Bernard, where do you think these jobs are going to come from, particularly given that we will have a range of skill sets?
Well, I think the range of skill sets is very indicative of where the jobs will end up. I think building and construction, infrastructure, just building the fabric of a city that can accommodate another 3 million people in 15 years, I think is important. But in addition to the skills, there is another thing that I think we need to do, and that is, and this is what I would implore the Premier to pursue with great vigour, that is a culture of entrepreneurship. For there to be jobs of the future, there needs to be businesses of the future. For there to be businesses of the future, we need to be far more entrepreneurial as a people. We need to support business people that actually take risks, that employ people, that pay taxes, that do the right thing. That's the culture that I think will deliver the businesses of the future. So it's not just about the bits and pieces. There are cultural shifts that need to take place. And that supporting business, I think, is part of that story.
The acceptance of the people who are already here is going to be absolutely crucial. And Lucinda, how do you integrate? How do you make these new arrivals feel part of the community and the existing community be welcoming?
I mean, there's no easy answers to that question, but I think it will require a high degree of intentionality from existing and moving residents to make that work. But I think politically this needs to be seen as a major, major risk, that not doing this right will be a disaster. It needs to be as prioritised as new railway lines and homes. And there are many different strategies for looking at doing that well, and a lot of it is just building relationships. So socialisation of people together with different cultures, enormously effective.
And yet today, 1 in 3 people don't know their neighbours.
Exactly, yeah. So it does require a huge shift in that. And yes, there are many online tools and many different mechanisms for achieving that through technology, but there is also a lot of evidence to suggest that you actually need face-to-face contact to build up tolerance. So you might build trust online, but you don't get tolerance of different cultures unless you actually have regular contact with people. A lot of it's about having a shared goal and a shared vision about how we are going to work together to make this work. And that could be at a neighbourhood scale, it could be at a city scale, of looking at if you know what your future looks like, it's much easier to get on board with the changes that everyone will need to make that work.
So just to add to that, I mean, I agree with that absolutely. So you've got to get that right. I think one of the issues as well, which the government of the day would need to determine, is, do you elevate this? Is it an address to the nation? Is it this is the challenge? It's likely to continue. The climate change is real. We're going to see more people. Not everyone's going to like it, but this is what we need to do as a society.
Are we at the point of benevolent dictatorship here? Do you start to change the political system so you can get through what you want?
Well, we were joking about that earlier on the panel, but
I don't think it was a joke, actually.
But the politics of this is difficult. I mean, people will remember it was difficult when I was in government because the population started growing very rapidly. And what you see is population growth, but that's then manifest in things like public transport usage, which suddenly hits 7 and 8 and 9% per annum in trips. So this is a key question. I've just come back from Shanghai, as you know. Where I was staying, they built a new city, a new suburb, Minham. They've done that in the space of 18 months. There's nothing above 10 stories, and it's just done. But that's a very different system to us.
Well, what you're actually talking about here is a catastrophe scenario. It's not unlike a war footing. And during the Second World War, there was a war cabinet, and certain decisions were taken in the interests of the entire community. What you need, therefore, is a narrative and leadership. Looking to you, Premier, and others, to actually explain. This is a national emergency. We aren't being singled out. Sydney's doing its bit, Brisbane's doing its bit, other cities around the world are doing their bits. We therefore need to actually pull together as a people. I think there is an opportunity here to actually leverage, never let a catastrophe is an opportunity to actually bind us together. We are divided because we're safe, secure and prosperous. If we feel threatened by a situation, by a war or by a catastrophe, there is a tendency for us to want to come together to survive. How can we leverage that to actually survive the situation and to deliver perhaps even a better, more prosperous but bigger Melbourne?
And Rob, in your 7.5% scenario, how would you do that?
Well, I think, the talk about this catastrophe is an interesting one, because in Christchurch, when they had the earthquake, the very next day, they'd lost half their schools. And within days, they had every student back at school. What did they do? They ran a school in the morning, a school in the afternoon. They could have run one in the evening. And where do we actually meet most of the people? We arrived with young kids in this country 35 years ago. Most of our friends today came out of that school experience. That's where, in many cases, community comes together. So we need to look to that infrastructure and say, how do we leverage off that? So rather than announcing we're going to build 100 schools, as the Premier did this morning, do we actually say, no, we're going to run, double schools or treble schools? And that means the schools used by people who might not speak English when they come with this catastrophe, and therefore meet other people.
So it's greater efficiency and it's also greater mixing. Shara, what's your...
I was going to say we can use technology a lot more intelligently. If I think of any major city, including Melbourne, look at the office buildings that are empty for at least 12 hours a day. If you start to look at modular infrastructure inside the buildings, why couldn't they be habitats for people at the time that they're not being used as an office. So there's really smart things that we can do that also starts to build up a sense of community that uses existing infrastructure. And there are new technologies like 3D printing of homes, where literally you've got a giant robot 3D printer and you can print a home for the equivalent of about $5,000 using construction refuse.
And in fact, they're doing that at the moment in Switzerland. They're doing that.
They're doing it in China. They've already exported some of the buildings that they've made to the United Arab Emirates, and they're doing it in Russia, where they're building curved buildings with giant robotic 3D printers. And if you're using construction refuse, well, you know, you're actually helping the environment and creating new spaces.
And I think that as the panel is having its discussion about how you make people feel welcome and how you integrate them, the conversation rapidly turns to the issue of law and order. That's on the front page of the newspapers every day, even before you announce that there's going to be a massive population influx. And Ishaan, talking about technology, how can technology help make people feel safer in a bigger city?
Well, one of the challenges we're going to have is that we simply won't have the resources to be able to increase the police and the essential emergency services to the extent that's proportionate with our population growth. So you heard this theme of we're just going to have to do more with the resources that are available to us. And at the same time, we're going to have to carefully balance civil liberties and privacy and those rights as well. So that's going to be a real tension for us. But there are some real technologies that would make a big difference in terms of security and in terms of health. So the first is there are a number of cities experimenting with predicting crime and understanding patterns in crime in a way that allows them to deploy, for example, police resources and police patrols into the area. So, for example, Santa Cruz in California had a program using historic data to try to identify where burglaries would happen, and they were able to put patrols in the right places and reduce burglaries by 14% in a pretty short period of time. There's also a lot of technology that helps you accelerate response time. So optimizing the routes of emergency response vehicles can actually reduce the response time by about 20 to 35%.
What about facial recognition technology? How much will that change the game?
Well, it'll change almost everything that we do in terms of the ability, for example, to walk through an airport without having to really go through a very cumbersome security scanning process. And already around the world, security agencies are using facial recognition to detect and prevent terrorist incidents. Of course, there is a huge question around the fact that that is an enormous database of people's personal characteristics. And the Minority Report example that you showed,
the Hollywood film,
is one that is probably much more real than we can think. So there's going to have to be a big debate about that. But really, we are going to have to start to use some of these technologies if we have any chance of maintaining law and order in a 8.7 million person city.
Indeed, Bernard, we don't accept technology that readily, do we? I mean, we only have to look at the government's current My Health record, and given the option to opt out, many people are.
Well, that's true. Look, I think there is a role for technology, but I would like to just reiterate to the Premier that this is a catastrophe. This is a major situation for this community to double or treble its rate of growth. We need to think very differently, and certainly there is a role for technology. We need the benign dictatorship, perhaps, but we also need to do something that I think is quite unique to Australia, certainly unique to Melbourne, and that is to mobilise the community, the everyday community, whether it's church groups, whether it's sporting groups, whether it's certain service groups or education or schools or whatever. We could mobilise, just as during the Second World War we mobilised the female workforce. We could mobilise the entire human capacity of Melbourne. What can you do as an individual? Ask not what your country, what city can do for you, what you can do for Melbourne, for this situation. To me, I can see that Melburnians, Victorians, would lead the country in this regard and actually create that culture. I think given the right motivation, the threat, if you like, I think that we would come together.
Lucinda, do you think so? I mean, you watch people's social data all the time.
Yeah, I absolutely always, I'm an optimist, and I think the best of humanity when people are given opportunity to act in that way. I mean, there are so many ways, speaking of technology before, that yes, there are many threats, but there are so many ways that this can help us solve these kinds of social challenges. I mean, even now, the data footprints that you and I are leaving around about the places we go and what we value and where we spend time is this incredible data set into understanding how cities work in real time. And by understanding how cities work in real time, you can then plan and program them more effectively. So there are so many different ways that we can start to harness technology to help us solve both social and physical problems in our cities.
And yet, Shara, privacy is such a big issue.
Oh, it's huge, and especially with facial recognition, you've got this fine line between a surveillance state and having an area that's safe. I think in the very near future, you're not going to be able to commit a crime and get away with it at all unless you're wearing a mask or you've got an invisibility shield, and believe it or not, there are scientists that are working on things like that, or you're in an area with no cameras, which will be increasingly unlikely. But I think there are also ways that we can use technology and other incentives to get the community involved. And here I'm thinking of energy and solar panels. For instance, what if we had a policy, we know we're going to need more energy because we have more people, we're going to have more infrastructure, more things that need to be powered. What if we had a policy that said, we're going to give grants to put solar panels on every home and every building in Melbourne and the surrounding area? That will start to get a lot of people saying, hey, this is actually in my best interest because I'm now getting something from my house or my apartment or wherever I'm living that benefits me as an individual, and I'm contributing back to society.
And indeed, there may be incentives. We'll ask the Premier in a minute, but before I do that, the conversation does turn to how smart cities can be more efficient, because the point that's been made about resources, we are, of course, in a climate crisis, so we're going to need more water, more food, generally more resources. How can technology help to make them available?
So one of the key technologies is distributed energy generation, which is going to be really important, solar and others such as heat into power. But we're also just going to have to get much more efficient with the way that we use energy and water, and also the amount of waste we produce. And so, there are a range of really interesting applications of data out there to try to help us almost gamify and create a competition around the amount of energy and water we use. And there are a number of cities in the world that are actually providing households and businesses with that data at a really detailed level, which on average is reducing usage by as much as 15%.
But that raises another question that goes to privacy. I mean, Rob, how happy would you be to have water sensors in every room or electricity sensors in every room, so they knew how many times you flushed the toilet, whether you turned the light on, who was at home, who left the door of the fridge open?
Sure. I think, we could get to the stage where, going back to Bernard's narrative, if we talk too much about the technology, we won't bring the community with us. So you've got to then think about what is the narrative that allows you to do what we're saying, but makes people feel that they're the participants and part of it. And I'll give you an example. If you put most of the development on 7.5% of the metro area, 92.5% is left. So suburbia could be the new green wedge. And you could be saying to people, your challenge, contextualizing the problem, is to collect your water, plant more trees and put solar panels on your roof. You've become the new green wedge. And by the way, you can walk to the high street now where there are jobs and opportunities and all the rest of it. So I'd spend less on cameras and a bit more on actually, backing the people in some of these situations. And I think that narrative, we see diagrams, the sci-fi diagrams we saw at the start. What that does is frighten people. If you think what the 7.5% city looks like in 30 years' time, it's not much different to today. Along the main routes, you've got 5 to 8 stories. We're seeing that already in Fitzroy and Smith Street and places like that. It's not frightening if it's in the right place, and it doesn't penetrate back into the suburbs. We're seeing how the city can, in fact, look very much as it does today. It will feel familiar. It won't be sci-fi. And so let's not frighten people by a narrative that says we're going to change everything, because you don't change cities in 15 years.
And Shara, is that one of the problems with technology, that we tend to sort of, jump ahead of ourselves, and we do need to be taken with it?
Well, it's accelerating so fast that you can't put your head in the sand, especially with artificial intelligence and predictive intelligence. But one of the things that we can do that I think won't make people frightened is use more and more sensors to be able to actually get like microclimates of individual parts of the city and neighborhoods. So if you can imagine a cluster of sensors sitting on a light post that's collecting information about pollutants in the air, about the temperature, about vehicular traffic and pedestrian traffic, not as you as an individual, but just as people passing by, and have that as open source data and allow city planners to have access to it, app planners. That's already happening in Chicago. They've got a project called the Array of Things where they're actually putting these clusters of sensors on light poles, and they're going to roll out 500 of them around the city.
Actually, every light globe in the city of Melbourne has been changed over to LED, and they have that ability.
So well, that Premier, this is a whole, I suppose, new world for you. Do you mandate the use of sensors? Do you say every building, not just new buildings, must have smart meter, solar hot water, maybe even an electric car charging station?
I think you use this as an opportunity to as I say, to achieve carbon neutrality, but to use world's best technology and to elevate the focus on environmental benefits, and technology will help us do that. The fact is that with the Internet of Things, the sensors are being rolled out in the water system already. They save a huge amount of power, they save a huge amount of water, they make the sewage system work better. We see them with our cars. There's going to be more and more in cars, and particularly with autonomous vehicles in the future. So those things, that technology is available, and yes, you would be mandating in any of these new developments in the future that they're going to be a minimum 6-star, or probably my expert panel would probably say 7-star is where we ought to be, or even I saw houses built after the bushfires in 2009. They were built to 8-star ratings, and you go in them and they've still got plenty of window, but it's double and triple glazed, it's north facing and so on. I think just to go to back to the point before about whether Bernard's point about whether this is a catastrophe or a crisis. We did see, it's nearly 10 years now since those terrible bushfires, but we saw after that the most extraordinary contribution from the community. We had people working in volunteer centres right across the state for 2 and 3 months. Victorians and Australians donated $400 million to help people, which is by far the most that's ever been donated. So Bernard's right, if you identify the challenge and you can get people on board, they will work together. But there's a few bits of the jigsaw yet. We've got to work out how we pay for this.
You're all incredibly aware around the table that you can have lofty ideas about how this might work, but cold hard cash is often what it comes down to. And Premier, you were indeed Treasurer for some years. How do you juggle this? And are some people going to end up being rather disappointed as some projects get the green light and others are put on hold?
Well, that may well be the case, and you'd have to do the numbers and see. And I agree absolutely. Challenge number one, step number one, is to see how you can use existing infrastructure better. We're not very good at doing that in Australia, but technology can help with that. But there will need to be new infrastructure. There will need to be new schools. There will need to be new community health centres. There will need to be arguably new hospitals, more hospital beds and those things. So you do have to pay for those. Part of that can come from value capture, as Rob said, but the reality is it will probably be less than 10% of the total. So do you want to burden the public? Do they want to be burdened with increased taxes paying for people they've never seen before or met before? Maybe they will burn it, but maybe they won't. Then there's generational equity issues. You can borrow the money. Victoria's got a strong AAA credit rating, but of course when you borrow the money, it's the younger people who will end up paying it back, not the older folk like me. So there's a lot of complex questions on that. Do you put up the user charges for using public transport? We only recover 40% of the cost of running public transport from the Mikey, from the cash. Do you put that up? But again, that's going to have a political impact. So, and then of course the federal government, who still collect most of the revenue in Australia, I would be saying we need to have quarterly COAG meetings, Council of Australian Government. We need to get a coordinated, cohesive and agreed strategy at a national level, including the contribution that the federal government will make on
And I can tell you at this point, sadly, for Victoria's sake, that the federal government is rather busy at the moment. They've got a number of climate refugees who are going into other cities that are not quite so well endowed and don't have the borrowing capacity of Victoria. So Victoria is rather on their own at this point. And you haven't actually even mentioned the role of the private sector. But before I get to the private sector, Bernard, will Victorians, do you think, accept, in your optimistic scenario, accept that they may have to take on some debt and that their children may be loaded up with paying for what is needed today?
Look, I actually think that is the case. If you look at other states, they're loaded up with debt. We've been well managed, of course, in the past. Have to say. But that is the truth. Even at a national level, our net debt sits at about 20% of GDP. In the US, it's close to 100%. Like it or not, we could actually leverage up our debt quite significantly into the future. Whether it's right or wrong or good or bad is not the point. The thing is, I think we could do that. The other point is that if we are leveraging up, increasing all these workers into Australia, then there is a liability that they need to pay. I mean, if you come to Australia provided with safety, security, yes, that's terrific, but you really do need to make a significant contribution.
I also want to ask about the private sector, which you haven't brought in. I would imagine, Ishaan, that the private sector would be terribly keen to get their hands on some of this and potentially even hold the government to ransom. You need this now, you have to pay for it.
Well, I think in Australia we're actually very mature when we think about infrastructure funding, for example, coming from the private sector by international standards. We looked at the smart technology applications, some of which we've all been talking about, and about 60% of those could actually be funded directly commercially if we had the right ecosystem of innovation. And of course, government's got a role to play in putting the policy framework there so that those technologies aren't either abused or used in a way that doesn't benefit society. But you could actually get 60% of that funding directly from the private sector, from the superannuation funds or pension funds globally who would be able to invest in this. So we don't need to kind of make this 100% a sort of taxpayer problem. Of course, some of that will come back to the taxpayer if it's the government that's the customer. I think with good value capture, you'll get some more of that, but it is about making the entire economy work, not just taxpayers.
So, Rob, would that be attractive to you? If 60% coming from the private sector would be a good thing for the City of Melbourne, wouldn't it?
Well, I worry a bit about it. I mean, I'm not a great supporter of, for instance, the private-public partnerships. I think public pays more in the long term out of those than if government had actually borrowed the money at the lower interest rates and done it themselves. So I think there are two things coming into this debate. One is, how do you fund the infrastructure, and which infrastructure do you fund? Because at the moment, if you look around Melbourne, there seem to be a lot of freeways being built, and there's not a city in the world that has solved their congestion problem by building more roads. So,
And indeed, we haven't talked about car ownership, but whether or not we even own cars in the future.
Try to hold me back. The car is the worst investment you'll ever make in your life. It devalues the day you buy it. It goes down rapidly. You mostly spend, the whole car will cost you possibly in Melbourne $16,000 a year. Well, that's before your road taxes.
Rob, you'll be pleased to know, Ishaan, I think that you've done some research on this, and I think you think that car ownership will soon become something in history.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear that autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and you combine the two of those things, by 2025, we see both the technology being mature enough and the costs coming down sufficiently with battery technology so that they are just far superior to internal combustion engines and cars that are driven by human beings. But there are two pathways we could go down. Right? We could go down the world of what we call private autonomy, which is everyone has their own autonomous vehicle, which might actually increase the amount of traffic on the roads and put more stress on the road system that you talked about. Or, and this is happening in Melbourne and in Sydney, real experiments with the idea of door-to-door shared autonomous electric vehicles, where it's actually even more convenient than owning your own car, the ability to have an integrated transport platform where you can have a minibus come pick you up in a matter of minutes from your home and drop you at work or at the shops or wherever. And actually that really takes cars off the road. And combined with the sort of more mass transit systems like trains, then it can be really powerful.
Melbourne has been built around the car, but that's cultural. I think that can change over time. This issue of infrastructure and getting more efficiency out of existing infrastructure. What if in my wartime cabinet, benevolent dictatorship, we said it's a crisis situation and we mandate that where possible, every employee is to work from home 1 day a week. So that's 20% of the workforce. Average across the workforce, maybe 10% of people don't go to work. That gives you greater capacity. That combined with the technologies that you've... So working with people plus technology gives you a solution, but you need the wartime cabinet mindset in order to make it happen.
So these, I was just going to say, these things, the same with roads and freeways. You know, with CityLink, we negotiated to try and reduce the toll in off-peak hours, right, to get that even spread, but they didn't want to negotiate. And there's no way you can compel. But if you had a wartime cabinet,
I would compel.
I've actually lived through that very interesting situation where overnight there was petrol rationing, and you got 6 coupons.
This is in Zimbabwe.
This was in Zimbabwe. 6 coupons, 4 litres each. And we all thought, this has got to be a catastrophe. Harare is pretty much like Melbourne. It's a sprawling city. Their public transport isn't as good as ours, unfortunately. But within a week, the community had adapted. We actually shared cars. You got to know the neighbour. You picked up the people who needed help. You know, the whole community came together. So, you know, that wartime, I hate the term, by the way. You know, but that crisis mentality, when everybody's placed on the equal footing, when we had water shortages in Victoria, you were asked to, you know, use only so many litres, and we did it.
So let's take a vote on our panel here. Are we all voting for a wartime, for a crisis footing, for a benevolent dictatorship for a period of, say, 5 to 6 years while we get ourselves sorted? A show of hands, perhaps, from the panel?
No.
It would seem that democracy is alive and well.
Thank you for your support.
Just as well, I didn't go into politics.
Yes, indeed it is. But let us jump forward a decade here. The first major wave of climate refugees is well and truly settled in Melbourne now, and the trickle has become a rush as we head towards our 15-year deadline. Bernard, look into your crystal ball. How are we coping?
In 10 years' time, we would be right in the thick of it. So instead of 130,000 people per year, we're up around 450,000. The community has been mobilised. New technology has arrived. There's a sense of significant change. I think there are pockets and periods where we're threatened by the extent of the change, and there are grumblings and rumblings in the community. But overall, there is this positivism, this electric, where we feel as though we're living through a moment in history, and we are determined to create a better society, a better Melbourne at the end of it. It's a challenge. You're actually appealing to the positive side of humanity as opposed to self-interest and greed. We're trying to create something better. I see a better Melbourne in 10 years' time.
Rob, do you see a healthier Melbourne?
I do. I actually think, and the stats are there today, that if you live in the inner city, you're less likely to die of a heart attack than if you live in suburbia. Why? You're walking more. So if you start to densify the city and you actually have more people coming together, meeting, sharing facilities, and I think the shared economy will actually make us more sympathetic and create community, I think you'll find not only is a healthier city, it's more socially cohesive, it'll be environmentally more sustainable, and I think it'll be economically vibrant.
Is that right, Lucinda? Have we sacrificed our communities because of our time pressures, or are we healthy communities?
Well, with the push for a new sharing economy, I think we will have a new normal. And just to give you an indication of how quickly things can change, and I'm going to use an example going back 100 years, but in 1898 was the first ever conference of urban planners in New York, and the #1 topic of discussion was how they were going to deal with the horse manure, because it was predicted that by 1930 the horse manure would be up to the first floor of the buildings. And of course that never eventuated because the way we live changed so dramatically, and now we're accelerating that time frame now and technology is growing exponentially, but people can change and adapt to a new normal. And if we look at not just in Australia but globally how much population is changing, this will be our new normal, and I think in 10 years' time we will have adapted and we will have seen the benefits of having a smaller individual footprint and a larger community footprint.
And Ishaan, are we making the most of the technology that we should be employing?
Yeah, I think one thing Melburnians love is the idea of being world-class and world-leading. And I think that's one of the things that we will have really embraced in 10 years' time with technology, really taken that challenge on to be a smart city, to be connected, to show the world, you know, really what we're made of. And some of these things that we're seeing are actually enhancing things that we think are really Melburnian. The increased density means, you know, the cafe culture is even stronger than it always was. We've got retail laneways being revitalised again. So I think, you know, I think there's that sort of sense of world leadership that will bind us together as well.
Shara, have we been brave?
Well, I think the corporations can take a big role in this too, from a social responsibility perspective, because while we've got this population growth happening, we still have the technological acceleration and, in particular, automation that is changing the workforce and the nature of jobs. And if we look at the corporations to be the role leader for actually retraining, reskilling, constantly helping people re-educate, whether they stay with the company or move on, then we've got another piece of the puzzle that's being helped solved in a community way. And instead of just thinking of your employer as the place where you get your paycheck, suddenly they're an integral part of your personal life because they're actually helping you and your family along with a career path, as well as helping to educate all of these new people that are coming in an influx, and doing so in a community fashion rather than just for corporate greed.
Premier, it's often said that if you build it, they will come. They came. Did we build it?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, we did. So we did, and I think there's a fair bit of truth in that field of dreams. You build it, they will come, and Melbourne's proof of that. You know, the reason Melbourne's population, notwithstanding this crisis we've got, but Melbourne's population has increased so substantially in the last 15 years is because the quality of life that we enjoy is so good. And so more people want to live here. But I'm an optimist, but I think Bernard is probably overly optimistic about, I just think he is, because if you look around the world, you know, there are 65 million refugees around the world, not counting climate refugees, and they can't find a home. And if you look at election results around the world, whether it's Britain or Germany or the United States, the public doesn't easily warm to massive increases in population growth or new arrivals. So I think getting the policies right, and I think we've had a good discussion on that. Technology is important, but not making it the be-all. We don't want this to be the multifunction policy, you know, sort of disaster of the 80s. I think setting a challenge about Melburnians, Victorians, just being a step above everything else and having that stronger global view about our place in the world and what we can do. But even with bipartisan support, I think you will see some splintering politically. You know, you will see minor parties of the hard left and you will see minor parties of the hard right. That's what's been happening around the world.
But if we take a centre picture 10 years on, are we where we should be with this project?
No, I think it's doable and achievable. And then, of course, those numbers, as Bernard said, they ramp up. Then we're going to be in stage 2, which is our challenge next year, where you're going to ask us where we're going to put people in the regions. But that's for next year.
Well, look, we will leave our hypothetical there. I think the point has been made that, yes, it's complex, but if we can at least start to house 3 million more people in just 15 years, there's no need to panic about 3 million more in 30 years, which is what the current predictions are. Can you please join me in thanking our panel very much for their insights? And thank you all for coming, and thank you for your support of this series. We've really thoroughly enjoyed bringing it to you, and you've been wonderful to come along and give us your support, so thank you.